A young black girl's boarding pass is torn in half by an older white agent at a major U.S. airport, an act of quiet cruelty that would one day ignite a movement and transform an entire system. They didn't yell, they didn't curse, they didn't need to. All it took was a hand, white, practiced, unbothered, ripping Zuri's boarding pass in two like yesterday's receipt. 11 years old, alone, black, brilliant. None of it mattered. Not to the woman in uniform, not to the airport where she was trained, not to the country that built the airport in the first place. This wasn't the South in 1963. This was Chicago, present day. And still, Zuri was too brown to board. They didn't drag her, no. That would have made headlines. They erased her quietly, dismissed her like dust. This is how racism survives now. Not with fire, but with forms. Not with fists, but with policies. It smiles, it shrugs, it doesn't even need to lie, because it knows the world will look away. But Zuri didn't. She stood still, and in that stillness, a reckoning began. At 12, Zuri Ellison learned that silence isn't quiet, it's a verdict. Her boarding pass may have been torn, but what shattered more was the silence that followed. No protest. No hesitation. The woman who ripped it didn't flinch. The bystanders didn't blink. And the system that allowed it stood as still as the moment itself. That kind of silence doesn't echo. It erodes. 2 years later, Zuri wasn't just a girl with a memory. She was a young woman with a mission. At 14, she stood before the National Aviation Ethics Symposium, a place where the stories of people like her were often buried under polished speeches and corporate spin. She hadn't been invited to inspire. She had been forced onto the stage by the viral footage of her humiliation and the mounting pressure for someone, anyone, to say something real, finally. She wasn't here to play nice. The conference room was as cold as the system it represented. Suits filled every row. Cameras blinked silently. This wasn't a place for children. But Zuri had never been given the luxury of childhood. She approached the podium. Her father, David Ellison, watched from the back, his eyes holding a storm he'd learned to bottle. Zuri didn't wait for applause. She began with the truth. 2 years ago, a woman tore my boarding pass in half. She didn't scan it. She didn't ask. She just looked at me and decided I didn't belong. That moment didn't end when the paper fell to the floor. It began something. Because when you tear a child's right to belong, you don't just damage her day. You declare war on her future. The air shifted. Her voice did not. That wasn't a mistake. That was a decision wrapped in silence. The kind of silence that says, you should have known better than to think this place was built for you. But I knew better, because I've been building planes since I was 4. And what I learned is this: altitude doesn't erase bias. It exposes it. You want to talk about ethics? Then let's discuss policies written in neutral language that are only enforced against specific individuals. Let's discuss protocols that target without being named. Let's discuss the subtle ways we criminalize presence. Her words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were surgical. She didn't speak in shock. She talked to reveal. They call it standard procedure. I call it camouflaged exclusion. And I'm done being quiet about it. Behind her, images flashed on the screen. A still of her at 12, boarding pass ripped. A headline about a Sikh man removed from a flight. A quote from an elder Latina woman who was asked to translate for 3 TSA agents. A pause. Then more. They asked me to prove I could afford my ticket. I had to show them my bank app in front of everyone. I was told my hijab was concerning. They made me take it off behind a curtain, but someone walked in anyway. A black gate agent saw me panicking. She came over, held my hand, and said, "You deserve to be here." I didn't even know how much I needed that. These weren't stories for pity. They were indictments. Zuri turned back to the room. If ethics isn't uncomfortable, it's not real. If inclusion doesn't change who holds power, it's decoration. I'm not asking for an apology. I'm demanding accountability. This isn't about bad apples. It's about broken barrels. Her voice didn't tremble. It landed. Her father lowered his head. Not in shame, in awe. In that moment, Zuri wasn't just his daughter. She was a catalyst. That speech was viewed 16 million times in 1 week. School curricula downloaded it. Unions screened it. A senator quoted her in a hearing. And yet, the backlash came, as it always does. She's privileged. She's just playing activist. This isn't about race. It's about security. Zuri didn't flinch. She filmed a simple response in her backyard. No lights, no crew, just her, speaking directly. Privilege doesn't shield you from bias. It just delays the moment it reaches you. If a CEO's daughter can be treated this way in daylight, imagine the stories that never make it to video. Within 48 hours, 3 major airlines announced the results of their internal audits. Zuri didn't want reform without stories. She then launched Passenger Chronicles, a digital archive where travelers could anonymously submit their experiences. Over 10,000 arrived in the first month. Some were raw, some redemptive, but all were real. These stories were curated into Invisible Runways, a traveling exhibit now hosted in DC, with plans to expand. Zuri's name was now more than viral. It was vital. And yet, she stayed grounded and still attended class. Still sketched drones and still sat quietly when she wasn't speaking the truth. Because her mission wasn't a moment, it was a movement. She wasn't here to be the exception. She was here to open the gate. Later that fall, she received a letter from an elderly man in Mississippi. He wrote in a trembling script that he remembered the colored-only signs above the bus seats. He said Zuri reminded him that injustice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it wears a uniform and smiles as it denies you. He ended with, "Thank you for giving me hope that my grandchildren might board with dignity." Her team compiled thousands of similar letters. From school kids, from grandmothers, from pilots who had stayed silent too long. And with them, Zuri formed the Sky Ledger, a living archive of testimonies and reforms, visible, open, unfiltered. At the next shareholder summit of her father's company, she was invited to speak. She didn't prepare a speech. She brought stories. She read them aloud. Each one is a window into the quiet injustices people carry like luggage with no claim ticket. When she finished, no one clapped. They stood. Her father joined her on stage. He didn't take the mic. He placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "This is the future of flight. Not numbers, not metal, but memory." And that day, in a room once closed to voices like hers, Zuri didn't just rewrite the policy. She rewrote what it meant to fly free. The headlines had barely cooled, the apology still fresh in corporate ink, when Zuri Ellison stepped into the terminal again, not as a passenger, but as a reminder. A reminder that silence would never be safety, and survival was never enough. Across America, people had seen the footage. They'd heard the quiet tear of a boarding pass, a sound that somehow thundered louder than engines. But what they didn't see, what no viral video could contain, was the fire that had begun to kindle beneath Zuri's skin that day. Not just humiliation, not just grief, but ignition. And now, fire moved with her. It started quietly. Her father, David Ellison, CEO of Airus United, issued a carefully worded statement. "We are deeply troubled by what occurred to my daughter, and to any passenger who has ever been dismissed for who they are. This moment requires more than words. It requires change." The press called it damage control. Zuri called it a deadline. The truth was that systems don't change because of shame. They change when someone refuses to leave until the floorboards are torn up, the walls are inspected for rot, and the locks on the doors no longer separate people by color or class. So, at just 13, Zuri became the youngest advisor to the company's Inclusion and Accountability Task Force. A ceremonial role, they said, something to honor her voice. But Zuri had no interest in the ceremony. She had a list. The first item: every employee at Aris United would undergo mandatory bias training, not through PowerPoint presentations and corporate scripts, but through real-life narratives. Zuri curated testimony from dozens of passengers and staff of color. She edited the stories herself. She sat through every session, even the ones that made grown men squirm. "You're not just learning to fly planes," she told one flight crew during training. "You're learning how to see the people inside them." The media started calling her the girl who grounded giants. At first it amused her, then it irritated her, because she didn't want to be remembered for the day her ticket was torn. She wanted to be remembered for the days that followed, when she turned ashes into architecture. Her second initiative, conducting an internal audit of all employee complaints filed within the past 5 years. Hundreds of buried reports emerged, dismissed, ignored, or buried in HR lingo. A flight attendant was demoted after reporting racist passengers. A black engineer repeatedly passed over for leadership despite outperforming his white peers. A hijabi check-in agent who'd been reassigned for optics. Zuri read every single one. One evening, her father walked into the den and found her surrounded by printouts, a red pen in hand, her eyes swollen, but her gaze sharp. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "But this company isn't." So she kept reading, kept listening, kept refusing to let it be someone else's problem. The transformation of Aris United began not with budgets, but with belief. People didn't need to suffer in silence to be professionals. That dignity wasn't a reward. It was a right. And every gate agent, janitor, co-pilot, and porter deserved to have their name remembered, their truth acknowledged. Then came the more challenging part: resistance. An executive VP scoffed at the new policies, called them PR fluff, said the company would bleed out trying to appease every bleeding heart. Zuri attended that board meeting in person. She wore the same navy blazer that she had worn since the day her ticket was torn, sat across from him, steady-eyed, while the room fell silent. "You think this is about appeasing?" she said. "This is about landing a future where the runway isn't covered in blood." The VP resigned 3 weeks later. A union representative attempted to dismiss Zuri's initiatives as overreaching. He called her emotional. Zuri responded with metrics. Incident reports had dropped 28% in 2 months. Employee satisfaction up 36%. Passenger complaints involving racial bias have decreased by 42%. And most importantly, flight teams reported a stronger sense of community than ever before. "You call it emotional," she told him. "I call it measurable." But beyond the data, it was the stories that told the truth. Like Rosa, the elderly Mexican-American janitor who had worked at Terminal B for 19 years without a single raise. Zuri had seen her mopping floors during her first return to the airport and asked her name. No one else had, at least not in the past decade. Rosa was promoted to facilities operations lead within a month. Or Lamont, a young black baggage handler who had been falsely accused of theft by a supervisor with a history of profiling. He was cleared, apologized to, and rehired with back pay. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the moment Zuri called him personally. "You're not a file number," she said. "You're part of this flight path now." And slowly, the culture changed. Not because Zuri demanded it, but because she showed them what it felt like to be seen again. One of the most radical policies came from an idea Zuri sketched in her notebook during math class. What if every flight began with a human story? A new in-flight campaign has been launched, Seat 6B, featuring rotating video vignettes from Aris employees sharing their truths. A Korean-American flight attendant speaking about being told to whiten her accent. A gay pilot who flew silently for 20 years before feeling safe to come out. a maintenance worker who escaped domestic abuse and found sanctuary working graveyard shifts. These stories didn't delay flights, they grounded them. Passengers listened, some cried, others applauded. Most just looked around the cabin a little differently after that, saw people instead of uniforms. But the most defining moment of this second act came not from a boardroom or an announcement, but from a single flight. Zuri flew commercial, often anonymously, once a month. No fanfare, just her headphones, her sketch pad. On one of those flights, a little girl boarded late, alone, dark-skinned, clutching a backpack like it held the world. The gate agent knelt, tied her shoe, offered her a snack, and walked her to her seat. Zuri watched from 3 rows behind. When the plane landed, she approached the agent quietly. "You have no idea what you just did," she said softly. The woman smiled. "She reminded me of someone." Zuri nodded. "Me too." Zuri Ellison sat alone in the executive conference room, staring at the polished glass table that reflected her face like a ghost. It was the same table where, months earlier, she had announced sweeping reforms for Horizon Airways. A new era, she had called it. Transparency, equity, accountability. Those words had landed like thunder, shaking the bones of a company long used to shadows. But now the silence around her screamed louder than any applause. Her allies were vanishing, one by one, and in the stillness, betrayal had found its way in. Her plan had been simple. Start at the heart. People. Restructure hiring, retraining, and reporting. Humanize policy. Give the voiceless a mic. But she hadn't accounted for the coldness behind closed smiles. For the way old power didn't die. It adapted, went underground, changed shape. And now, the resistance wasn't from the press or the public. It came from those who had nodded at her meetings, those who had whispered, "We support you," while signing memos that undermined her reforms. She'd made one mistake, one crucial one. She trusted Ethan Monroe. He was a legacy, son of a former COO. Brilliant, eloquent, young enough to understand change, old enough to speak boardroom fluently. Zuri had thought he was her bridge to the old guard. What he was a dam. Slowly, methodically, he had blocked her initiatives, rerouted her directives, diluted every bold stroke with policy jargon and compliance detours. The final blow had come that morning. An internal whistleblower report, anonymous but detailed, exposed that a round of performance terminations had disproportionately affected employees of color, particularly those who had spoken up during Zuri's Truth Window initiative. Zuri had authorized a transparency-driven review, not a purge. However, under Ethan's coordination, the review had been twisted into a form of retaliation. She confronted him, of course. In her office, eyes locked, voice calm. "Why?" she asked. Ethan didn't flinch. "Because you were tearing down a structure that people spent their lives building. It wasn't perfect, but it worked." "For whom?" she demanded. "For people who earned it." He walked out before she could respond. Zuri stood now at the edge of an impossible choice. Stay and fight from within a system that was armoring itself against her. Or step away, risking everything. But maybe, just maybe, lighting something freer. She turned toward the window. Below, the tarmac stretched like a map of chances. Planes landed and lifted. People came and went. A boy in a yellow hoodie waved goodbye to his mother, backpack slung too big over tiny shoulders. Zuri swallowed. That had been her once. Wide-eyed, soft-spoken, unshakable in her belief that doing the right thing changed things. Now she wasn't so sure. A knock. It was Mrs. C.O., now Director of Ethics, the one soul in this building who hadn't faltered. She stepped in, wordless, and set down a folder. "These are the resignations. Quiet ones. They believe in what you're doing. but they're afraid. Zuri flipped through the pages, names she knew, faces that had spoken truth in town halls, people who had carried the weight of her vision without asking for credit. Now they were slipping away, too exhausted to keep swimming upstream. "I thought we were building something real," Zuri whispered. "You were," Mrs. So replied gently. "You still are, but real doesn't mean painless." Zuri let the words settle. Her father had warned her once. "Change," he'd said, "is not a sprint. It's trench warfare. And sometimes, Zuri, even the people on your side won't want to be in the mud with you." She stood. "I need to speak to the staff." Mrs. Seo blinked. "Now?" "Now." They moved quickly. A message was sent to every team lead. Meet in the hangar. No cameras, no press, just people. Within the hour they came. Hundreds of employees, mechanics, janitors, flight crews, schedulers. Most hadn't seen her in person since the first month of her tenure. They expected a speech. What they got was silence, until Zuri stood on an old baggage cart, hands bare, eyes tired. "I won't lie to you," she began. "I'm tired, and I'm angry, not at the resistance, but at the way fear has replaced our courage." Murmurs rippled. "I believed that if we changed policy, hearts would follow. But I was wrong. Hearts don't follow policy. They follow people, stories, examples, and lately even that hasn't been enough." She paused, scanning faces. Some met her gaze. Others didn't. "I've lost allies. I've lost the support of key board members. And some of you, many of you, have been hurt in the crossfire. That's on me." Now they looked. But let me be clear. I will not ask you to keep following me into battles you didn't sign up for. I will not stand here and pretend the path ahead is clear. What I will say is this. I believe in us more than I believe in the structure that's failed us. She stepped down from the cart. "I don't know if I can save this company, but I do know I can build something new. If you want to stay here, I respect that. But if you want to build with me, meet me at Gate 17 tomorrow, 8 a.m. Then she walked away. The next morning, Zuri arrived early. The gate was quiet. A few janitors passed, nodding. She stood by the window, unsure if anyone would come. Then, one by one, they did. A flight attendant, a mechanic, an IT technician, Mrs. CO, Carl from security, even Malik, the intern who once shadowed her. By 8:15, there were 27 people. Not many, but enough. She looked at them. "We're not employees today, we're architects, and we're not asking permission anymore." Outside, a new plane touched down. Its tail bore no logo, just sky and silver. That's how it started. Not with a headline, not with a board vote, but with a woman betrayed by the system she tried to heal. She chose to rise again, not louder, but wiser. The sky didn't change for her, so she changed the runway. Zuri stood in front of the towering glass wall of the Horizon Skyways headquarters, her reflection caught in a web of lights and late-night traffic behind her. The skyline shimmered like a city dreaming, but Zuri was wide awake. She had won battles most could barely name. She had exposed corruption, restructured departments, and fired executives who thought themselves untouchable. But what no one told her was that after a revolution, silence doesn't feel like peace. It feels like isolation. The system hadn't folded. It had simply reshaped itself around her, smiling at her face while waiting for her to blink. And now, they were blinking first, not with force, but with fatigue. In the weeks following her sweeping reforms, Zuri noticed an energy shift. The whispers didn't grow louder. They just sank deeper into the walls. Executives nodded, but didn't listen. Managers complied, but stopped believing. And those she had lifted into new roles started questioning if the weight of change was worth the cost of comfort. That morning, she found an anonymous note slipped into her office inbox. It read, "You don't belong here. You never did. You were just a headline. We're waiting for you outside." It wasn't angry. It was worse, dismissive. Zuri crumpled it slowly and placed it in her drawer. Not because it hurt, but because it confirmed what she already knew. The fight was no longer about policy. It was about will. She called an emergency executive meeting, not to issue orders, but to ask questions. Real ones. "Tell me," she said, calm as ever, "what have we learned?" Silence. A senior VP cleared his throat. "That accountability is important. That we should value inclusion." Zuri nodded. "You said should, not do. Let's try again." No one spoke. She let the silence stretch until it bruised. "Because if we don't know what we've learned, then we haven't." Later that night, she sat in the company cafeteria with only a notepad, a lukewarm coffee, and her thoughts. The janitor, Mr. Bennett, a widower with 2 grandsons, passed by, pausing only briefly. "They don't deserve you, you know," he said. "But they need you." She smiled at him. "How do you know?" "Because the hallway you fixed last month, the one that used to leak every time it rained, I saw a girl in a wheelchair go through it last week without needing help for the first time. She didn't smile, but she didn't flinch either. That's what progress looks like." That moment didn't fix everything, but it reminded Zuri that she wasn't doing this to be loved. She was doing it so that someone could breathe easier without ever knowing her name. But then came the board. They had been patient, strategically so. Now, they were ready to rebalance leadership priorities. That's how they framed it. Behind closed doors, it meant, let's get back to business as usual. At a quarterly review meeting, the board chair, a man who had flown private since college, asked her to consider realignment of focus. "You've done admirable things," he said, "but perhaps now is the time to ease the pedal on the social stuff and refocus on growth." Zuri tilted her head. "Are you suggesting equity and growth are separate?" "I'm suggesting shareholders don't pay for moral victories." She stood, not dramatically, not angrily, just purposefully. "I see," she said. "Then maybe it's time we reconsider who this company is serving." Within a week, the internal pressure doubled. Projects were delayed. Budgets, accidentally, reallocated. Her calendar was filled with conflicts, which meant she was kept reactive instead of visionary. It wasn't a war. It was erosion. She could see what was coming. And so, she made a decision. Zuri called a press conference, without board approval. She stood alone before the podium, cameras flashing like lightning behind the clouds of institutional resistance. 2 years ago, she began, I was a child whose boarding pass was torn because someone didn't believe I deserved to fly. Today, I stand as the leader of one of the world's most influential airlines. And yet, the battles haven't changed. They've just gotten quieter, more polite, more efficient in their resistance. Her voice didn't shake. But let me be clear. Equity is not a phase. Inclusion is not a PR strategy. Dignity is not a distraction. If the only way to maintain power is to exclude others from it, then that power was never legitimate to begin with. The speech went viral in under an hour. Inside the company, the reactions split. Some departments applauded. Others braced for retaliation. The board stated that she had acted without consultation. The media speculated she would be removed. Investors panicked. Employees watched. And Zuri waited. 2 nights later, she handed in her resignation. Not as a retreat, but as a rebellion. She would not stay and become a symbol of compromised ideals. Instead, she launched something new. She called it Sky Seed, an independent non-profit incubator that combined ethical aviation research, youth mentorship, and equitable infrastructure design. Its goal wasn't just to build planes. It was to rebuild belief. Her departure sent shockwaves through the industry. Reporters hounded her. "Why leave now?" She answered simply, "Because I've planted the seed. Now I need to make sure it grows in soil that won't poison it." Skyseed attracted engineers, designers, teachers, and activists, people tired of asking permission to do the right thing. Within 6 months, they had opened labs in Detroit, Oakland, and Atlanta, cities where dreams had too often been grounded by poverty and prejudice. Zuri taught workshops not just on design, but on ethics, on how to build with everyone in mind, on how to hold the door open behind you. And something shifted. Former airline staff began applying to Skyseed. Young girls from neighborhoods like Zuri's showed up with sketches. Mechanics brought ideas. Teachers sent students. One day, a boy named Jonah, 12 years old, shy, eyes always scanning, handed her a folded note. Inside it read, "They called me a problem, but now I know I'm a blueprint." Zuri cried that night, not from sadness, but from relief, because she understood the fundamental transformation had never been about a company. It was always about people. And now, the sky wasn't the limit. It was only the beginning. Zuri sat alone in her office, the city lights flickering outside like 1,000 tiny, watchful eyes. The glass walls no longer felt transparent. They felt exposed. The floor beneath her feet, once a symbol of power, now felt like thin ice. She had walked into this company determined to reform it from within, to drag its conscience out from the shadows and hold it to the light. But change, she had come to realize, was a war waged inch by inch. And now, the resistance was no longer subtle. It was deliberate, coordinated, cold. They didn't yell. They didn't throw stones. They whispered. They slowed down processes. They left her out of email chains. They misfiled reports. They held pre-meetings without her. Senior managers who once applauded her reforms began to smile through gritted teeth. The head of legal stopped returning her calls. The CFO said the numbers just didn't justify the new initiatives. All of it is polite. All of it is poisonous. The worst betrayal came from someone she trusted. Elliot Banks, her father's longtime COO, a man who had known her since she was a child. He had been warm, supportive, her bridge to the old guard. However, when she rolled out the transparency audit system, Elliot quietly removed a clause from the contract before submitting it to the board for final approval. A clause that would have made executive bonuses contingent on measurable DEI improvements. She discovered this through a junior legal associate who had been too afraid to speak up until now. Zuri confronted him behind closed doors. He didn't deny it. "You're young," he said, his tone heavy with condescension. "You don't understand what it takes to steer a company of this size. Morality doesn't move markets." She looked him in the eye. "But people do, and you just proved why they don't trust us." She didn't fire him. She let the board see the redacted clause. She let the facts speak for themselves. Elliot resigned 2 weeks later for personal reasons. But the damage wasn't just structural, it was spiritual. Zuri began waking in the middle of the night with a sense of suffocation. Her dreams were filled with terminals and torn tickets, and voices whispering, "You don't belong here." She stopped attending the Friday executive socials. She ate lunch in her office. Her smile became a mask. Then came the internal leak. A whistleblower site published a confidential memo outlining the resistance tactics employed by a faction of regional directors, coded messages, delay schemes, manipulative press leaks, all designed to paint Zuri's leadership as reckless and unstable. The media ran with it. Headlines screamed, "Is Horizon losing altitude under Tran? Radical reform or corporate chaos?" Cable news panels dissected every decision she made. The board grew silent. The stock dipped 2.3%. Zuri held a press conference, not to apologize, but to confront. "I am not here to coddle comfort," she said, voice unwavering. "I am here to dismantle the invisible barriers that have kept so many of us grounded. This is turbulence, not failure, and turbulence is a sign you're moving." The room fell silent, but still, something in her shifted. She no longer believed the system could be saved from within. It had absorbed her, then begun to spit her out. It wore her reforms like a uniform, without living them. She realized she was patching a ship with holes no one else wanted to seal. And so she made a decision. She would step down, not in defeat, in evolution. In her final address to the company, Zuri didn't offer pleasantries or platitudes. She told them a story. "When I was 11, a woman tore my ticket in half because she didn't think a black child could be flying alone. She didn't need evidence. She had instinct. That's what systems do. They teach instinct before they teach equity. And now I realize it's not enough to fly the plane. Sometimes you have to build a new runway." She walked away from the podium. No applause, just silence, the kind that follows when someone speaks a truth too big to swallow immediately. In the months that followed, Zuri disappeared from the public eye. Rumors swirled. Some said she was writing a book. Others said she had taken a fellowship at Yale. None was true. She was building something, quietly, relentlessly. She gathered the most talented, overlooked, and underpaid minds she had met across her years in the industry. Engineers who had designed fleet innovations but never received the credit they deserved. Data analysts who had identified patterns of discrimination that went unaddressed. Former airline workers who had left the field after experiencing harassment, racial targeting, or burnout. She invited them not to reform the industry, but to reimagine it. Together, they launched Lyft Collective, a startup airline not based on seats, but on equity. Every staff member held stock. Every complaint triggered an immediate AI-monitored response. Every route was planned not just for profit, but for accessibility to underserved regions. Staff training included history, psychology, and restorative justice, as well as emergency procedures. Uniforms were optional. Names were honored. Stories were central. Investors were skeptical. "It sounds like a non-profit with wings," one scoffed. Zuri smiled. "Then maybe profit has forgotten its purpose." By the end of year one, Lyft had completed over 1 to 200 flights with a 94% satisfaction rating and a complaint rate of less than 0.2%. More importantly, it had become a symbol not just of innovation, but of intention. Former Horizon passengers began to switch, not out of protest, but out of belief. "It feels different," one customer wrote in a viral review, "like the plane knows you're human." The old guard took notice. Zuri received an anonymous letter, postmarked from Horizon HQ. Inside, a note written in careful cursive. "I didn't believe in you. I do now. Keep flying." No signature. Zuri didn't need one. She hung it next to her original torn boarding pass, still framed in her office. Because of this, she knew, was the real climb. Not toward power, but toward a purpose. Not for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told, "You're not supposed to be here." Zuri had left the tower, but she hadn't left the sky. The sun had not yet risen when Zuri unlocked the door to Lyft Collective's Atlanta headquarters. The air was thick with early spring mist, and the city still slept beneath a gray blanket of dreams and regrets. She walked in without fanfare, without an entourage, just her and the echo of her steps on the polished floor. It's been 6 months since Lyft's first flight. 6 months since she'd left the old world behind. And now, she stood at the edge of something even larger than she had imagined. The startup had gained traction faster than anyone predicted. Its flight schedule doubled in 3 months. Word of mouth from community leaders, educators, and social justice advocates had pushed Lyft into the national spotlight. But with momentum came tension. One morning, her chief operations lead, Lena, came into her office, eyes tight with frustration. "We have a problem," she said. "The FAA wants to do an unscheduled audit." Zuri looked up. "Unscheduled or retaliatory?" Lena didn't blink. "You know the answer." Zuri nodded. The pressure had been building. Whispers of Lyft's unconventional model had made it to the wrong ears, or maybe the right ones, depending on how you define disruption. The government, the legacy airlines, and even a few think tanks had begun to take offense. She was no longer a novelty. She was a threat. By noon, news of the audit had leaked. Pundits lined up on television screens. "Zuri Ellison faces her first real test," one declared. Another added, "Was Lyft too good to be true?" Zuri turned off the screens. That night, she gathered her senior team in the main hangar, sitting around a weathered cargo crate in folding chairs. "I need to ask something of you," she began. "More than compliance. More than transparency. I need your courage." They looked at her, not just as their CEO, but as the anchor of their collective defiance. "If they come to find cracks," she continued, "we show them craftsmanship. If they come to provoke fear, we answer with clarity. And if they come to dismantle us, we remind them we were never a house built on their blueprint." Silence. Then Lena stood. "We're with you." The audit came and went. It was brutal. Technically fair, but invasive. They inspected safety logs twice. They interviewed staff for hours. They demanded policy documentation written 2 days before it was even required. But they found nothing. No infractions, no violations. Lyft passed. Barely. Zuri didn't celebrate. Not yet. The next morning, she received an anonymous email with 2 words. Next phase. She knew what that meant. They weren't done. That same week, Lyft's insurance partner pulled coverage, citing uncertainty in the regulatory climate. 2 major investors withdrew. A planned expansion into Chicago was suddenly blocked by zoning regulations that hadn't been enforced in 20 years. "They're starving us," Lena said. Zuri didn't deny it. "Yes, because they can't beat us on merit." The team sat in quiet anger. "But that means," Zuri added, "we're closer than they want us to be." She proposed something radical. What if Lyft didn't just resist? What if it redefined resilience? They launched Project Sora, a multilingual platform that combines real-time passenger feedback, AI-based route optimization for environmental and social impact, and an educational module for school partnerships. It was a transportation ecosystem rooted in empathy. The press tried to ignore it. But teachers didn't. Students didn't. Families didn't. They began writing letters and posting testimonials, uploading videos of their first Lyft flights, tears in their eyes as they described what it felt like to be treated as human without exception. Zuri released a statement. "We don't exist to be tolerated. We exist to transform." Then came the invitation. The United Nations invited her to speak on global equity and infrastructure. Some warned her not to go. "It'll put a bigger target on your back." She smiled. The target's already there. At the UN Assembly, she didn't read from a script. She told a story of a girl whose ticket was once torn because she was perceived as a problem. Of an airline that said, "What if we saw people first?" Of a future that was never impossible, just inconvenient to those with power. She ended simply, "Let us not mistake innovation for invention. Equity is not new. It's just been ignored." A standing ovation followed, and the backlash. Legacy lobbyists filed complaints. Right-wing outlets declared her a radical in disguise. An anonymous op-ed accused her of weaponizing victimhood. But something had shifted. This time, Lyft's supporters didn't wait for permission. Activists marched at terminals in support. Flight attendants from rival airlines sent open letters. A coalition of airport workers across 6 cities went on strike, demanding that the lift model be made the standard. Zuri stood on a makeshift stage at one of the marches, megaphone in hand, heart full of fury and hope. "This was never about me," she told the crowd. "This is about all the flights you were told you weren't worthy of. This is about dignity at 36,000 feet. They chanted her name, but she shook her head. "Not my name," she said. "Yours. Ours." That night, she walked alone under the flickering lights of the tarmac. A janitor passed by, pushing a mop cart. He looked at her, paused. "You're doing it," he said. Zuri smiled. "Doing what?" "Turning the whole sky inside out." And for the first time in weeks, she breathed. Fully, freely, because even in turbulence she could see it now. The sky wasn't falling. It was opening. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows of Horizon Skyway's Seattle headquarters. Zuri Ellison sat alone in her office, the one her father, David, once occupied. 20 years ago, she was the little girl humiliated at an airport gate, a ticket torn, a future doubted. Now her name graced leadership conferences and DEI reform summits, but she hadn't come for applause. She came because something inside her still burned. Not anger, not revenge. Purpose. Across America, corporate institutions had begun mimicking her reforms. Airlines, hospitals, tech firms, and even federal agencies were launching internal truth sessions inspired by Horizon's storytelling project. But this was never about replication. It was about reckoning. And reckoning, Zuri believed, starts with remembering. That morning, she was preparing to unveil the next phase of her legacy. Not a product, not a campaign, but a restoration. She called it the archive. It was a digital and physical repository of untold stories from employees across every level: janitors, call center agents, flight engineers, immigrant custodians, crew members who had survived decades of discrimination in silence. It wouldn't just live in annual reports. It would live in public spaces, terminals, museum wings, and classrooms. A history written by those who endured it. Not the sanitized version, but the whole truth. Her advisors had warned her this was risky, politically unwise. Zuri had nodded and launched it anyway, because somewhere, in a quiet part of her soul, she still heard the sound of her boarding pass being torn. The pain hadn't left her. It had evolved. That afternoon, she stood on stage at Horizon's annual summit, not with charts or metrics, but with an envelope. "This," she said, holding it up, "was given to me when I was 11, a formal apology. Sealed. Issued by the airline executive board after my story went public." She paused. "I never opened it." Murmurs spread across the room. Zuri continued, "Because I didn't want closure. I wanted change. And change isn't sealed in envelopes. It's lived. Every day." She tore the letter in half, letting the pieces fall. Then, she told the story of Malik, a Horizon mechanic who spoke up when he saw a Muslim colleague targeted in a security check. He wasn't rewarded. He was transferred, silenced. That had been 5 years ago. Malik now led Horizon's new Equity Safety Division. His story, Zuri said, would be the first entry in the archive. The crowd didn't cheer. They stood, silent, moved. The next week, a shipment arrived at Zuri's office, an anonymous package containing decades of flight logs, photos, and handwritten journals from a former black flight attendant who had passed away. Her granddaughter wrote, "She kept these because no one would believe her otherwise. Now, I think she'd want someone to." Zuri wept over those pages, not from pity, but reverence. Every word was a monument. A truth buried is now unearthed. That month, the archive went live in Terminal D of Horizon's main hub. An interactive wall of rotating testimonies, audio, visual, and multilingual. Passengers stood in line just to listen. A Navajo elder described his first flight, where staff assumed he was drunk because of his accent. A Korean War veteran recalled being frisked on every trip post 9/11, despite his medals. A young Latina baggage handler told the story of how her father died undocumented, never knowing his daughter would rise through the system he feared. The stories didn't accuse, they revealed. And in doing so, they healed. At one gate, a mother cried, reading the testimony of a disabled passenger whose wheelchair was once lost on a Horizon flight. A crew member approached, knelt beside her and whispered, "We remember so we don't repeat." It became a phrase across uniforms. We remember so we don't repeat. Not PR, a promise. Zuri didn't stop at storytelling. She implemented restorative justice circles within Horizon. Victims could choose to confront those who had harmed them. Not for revenge, for acknowledgement, for truth. Meredith Caldwell, the gate agent who once tore Zuri's boarding pass, was the first to request a circle. Zuri accepted. The session was quiet, tense. Meredith wept, not theatrically, but with the breaking weight of guilt. Zuri didn't comfort her. She listened. At the end, she said, "You didn't break me, but you showed me what needed breaking. The system, not the person." Meredith now worked in training, not as punishment, but penance. Some objected. Zuri replied, "Redemption without responsibility is just rebranding." Across Horizon, new training modules included excerpts from the archive. Staff were asked, "What would you have done in this story?" Not hypothetical, historical. In flight schools, instructors now open each course with an archive session. One letter, one story, one life. Because flying, Zuri insisted, begins with grounding. Grounding in humanity, compassion, truth. One winter, a blizzard shut down 3 major airports. Flights were delayed for over 18 hours. But something unexpected happened. Staff stayed calm. Passengers shared food. No outbursts. A local news anchor reported, "It's as if they remembered. Everyone here matters." Zuri watched the footage from home and smiled. Her work wasn't just policy. It was a pulse. Horizon had changed. Not because the sky was different, but because the people beneath it were. And still, Zuri knew it wasn't over. Change is never finished. It's inherited. Carried forward. That's why she initiated Horizon Legacy Labs, youth-led innovation centers inside public high schools, focused on aviation, ethics, and inclusion. Students developed boarding systems for neurodiverse passengers, language apps for frontline staff, and new designs for more inclusive uniforms. Zuri didn't just want the industry to remember, she wanted it to evolve. And it did. Slowly, beautifully, because pain, when honored, becomes purpose. One day a father wrote, "My daughter boarded alone last week. First time. Brown, shy, brilliant. She came home and said, 'They treated me like I mattered. Thank you.'" Zuri printed that letter, framed it, placed it beside the photo of her 11-year-old self, eyes defiant, heart open, a future torn, now rebuilt, stronger, kinder, and hers, always hers. Zuri stood alone on the tarmac at dusk, the final rays of sunlight casting a golden path across the runway. Behind her, the Horizon Legacy Lab's new training jet gleamed under soft floodlights, adorned with names, not of donors or executives, but of passengers. Real people, real stories. It had taken years, more than she imagined, more than anyone thought possible, and still, she felt the same ache in her chest as she had the day she walked out of that boardroom. Not from pain, from power. The kind that only comes when you've walked through fire and come out with your soul intact. She had changed Horizon. She had launched Lift. She had turned history into an archive and suffering into a curriculum. But now, the question echoed inside her like a prayer. What comes after impact? Her phone vibrated in her pocket. A message. From Jonah. Now 19. About to graduate, interning at NASA. It read, "We're going to the moon, but I still think you aimed higher." She smiled, eyes stinging. This was never about altitude. It was always about access. And now, it was time to hand the cockpit over to others. She gathered her team that week: board members, youth leaders, veteran pilots, janitors, cafeteria workers, and announced she would step down as CEO of Lift and Horizon's Innovation Council by year's end. The room froze. Some gasped. Others just stared. She waited, then spoke. "I have given this mission everything, and now it's time I give it space to grow without me in the center. I'm not leaving the sky. I'm expanding it." The silence was broken by quiet tears, hands held, and a few knowing nods. Because authentic leadership doesn't cling, it clears the runway. In the weeks that followed, Zuri conducted handovers, not just of roles, but of meaning as well. She spent hours with new leaders, reviewing not just operations, but origins. Why did every protocol exist? What every story taught? She assigned each director a letter from the archive and asked them to study it like a flight manual, not to remember her, but to remember why. Then she disappeared from the headlines, not in a scandal, in serenity. She took a train across the country. No press, no entourage, just her, a journal, and the quiet luxury of reflection. In a small town in Montana, she visited an old pilot who had once been blacklisted for blowing the whistle. They drank tea on a porch. He said, "I used to think integrity got you exiled. You proved it gets you elevated." In Mississippi, she met a teacher who had created a flight club for girls using Lift's curriculum. One student had already been accepted into the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. "They believe," the teacher said, "because you believed first." In every city, someone knew her name. But more importantly, they were familiar with her work, not as a myth, as memory. Then, one spring morning, Zuri received a letter, a formal invitation from the Smithsonian. They wanted to create a permanent exhibit: Flight, Memory, and Justice, the Zuri Ellison Legacy. She declined, politely. Instead, she proposed a different title: Voices in the Sky, the People Who Changed Aviation. No spotlight, no statue, just stories, real ones. And they agreed. The exhibit launched with over 600 submissions: videos, letters, artifacts, family photos. One display featured a replica of Zuri's torn boarding pass. Above it, a quote: "They tried to stop me from boarding. I built a new airline instead." Children stood wide-eyed. Veterans saluted. Elders wept. Across from that wall stood a touchscreen labeled, "Who Helped You Fly?" Visitors typed names, mentors, mothers, friends. The wall filled up within weeks. Zuri visited once, quietly, disguised in a hoodie and jeans. She watched as a young black girl stood in front of her exhibit and whispered, "I want to be her." Zuri didn't interrupt. She didn't reveal herself. She just whispered back, "Then be more." Years passed. Lift expanded to Latin America and Africa. Horizon's archive has become a standard in university DEI courses. Former rivals adopted restorative practices. Passenger rights legislation was renamed the Ellison Bill. But Zuri stayed behind the scenes, writing, teaching, listening. She started hosting salons for young activists. No agenda, just space. She told them, "Disruption is the easy part. The real work is designing what comes next." One autumn, she received a message from Lena, who was now the CEO of Lyft. We're inviting the original crew back. Reunion flight. You in? Zuri hesitated, not out of pride, out of awe. Had it come this far? She agreed. The flight departed from Atlanta. Same hangar, same runway. But everything had changed. The boarding staff were multilingual. The signage included Braille. The safety demo featured spoken word and jazz. The seatback screens displayed archive stories. As Zuri took her seat, row 4A, window, she noticed a girl across the aisle. 10, maybe 11. Brown skin. Big glasses. Holding a journal. The girl looked at Zuri, unsure. "Are you?" she asked. Zuri smiled. "Yes, but I think you're the story now." The girl grinned. The plane took off. As the clouds parted, Zuri looked out and whispered a quiet truth. "This is what legacy feels like. Light, airborne, shared." And in that moment, the sky didn't seem so far. It seemed like home. She wasn't supposed to fly. She was supposed to wait, to sit quietly, to accept the ticket torn in half. The silence was handed to her in its place. But Zuri didn't wait. She walked to the gate anyway, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been told, "You're not meant to be here." And because she walked, others could run, could speak, could fly. This story is not a fairy tale. It's a mirror. And the reflection it holds is uncomfortable, powerful, and necessary. It asks, where were you when someone else's voice was ignored? It demands, what will you do the next time silence shows up dressed as politeness? Zuri didn't become a hero because she was strong. She became strong because she refused to be small. If this story resonated with you, don't dismiss it. Let it stay. Let it grow. Because history only changes when ordinary people decide to tell the truth, louder than the lies. If this story made your heart pause, share it. If it brought back memories, write them. If it gave you hope, pass it on. Subscribe to our channel, not for the content, but for the connection, for courage, for the community. Tell us in the comments, what story have you been carrying in silence? We read everything, because stories deserve witnesses. And so do you. Thank you for watching with us, and may your next step, however small, lift someone else just a little higher.